And now I'd like to invite Mr. Stephen Black to speak to us on poverty, faith and justice, the moral and civic purpose of the university. Thank you, Mr. Black.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You all may not know why I've been invited. I'm not a doctor. This actually is a result of your last conference. Everyone filled out comments, and there were a huge number of people who asked to hear from more lawyers from Alabama. So here I am. Your conference leadership is just delivering what you asked for. This is what I want to say. We got to start that clock because I'm going to go over if I don't have that thing guiding me. It's hard for me to say hello in 15 minutes, but fortunately for you all, I've got a clock. I want to speak quickly and briefly about what I consider to be the biggest single challenge facing not just the future of the entire principle behind Beyond Flexner, but I would argue the biggest single challenge facing the future of progress in this nation is not the threat of another recession, although that would suck, not the risk of another banking crisis, or the threat of terrorism, or addressing immigration. I would ask you respectfully to step back, consider the context in which we're all sitting in this room right now, and the single biggest way it's different than in previous generations is that here we are within our borders, 320 million of us, and every year for the last 60 years, you can document a growing majority of Americans segmenting and segregating themselves into more and more homogeneous communities, sharing only the viewpoints and conversations and experiences with people who are just like themselves. Whether you're one of the majority of children now in our country growing up in the suburbs, or if you're growing up in an urban neighborhood, or you're growing up in a rural community, you statistically have less likelihood to have a personal connection with any human being unlike yourself than any time in the history of the country. And please don't fool yourself into thinking technology is connecting us. It has that potential. Literally, if no one had ever heard of what one of these is, you could tell them honestly, almost everyone in our country, even the majority of people below the poverty line, has one. And for almost no cost, in less than 10 seconds, you can pull up almost every written word in history. Mind-blowing potential for connectedness. You all right now could pull up the diary entries of teenagers in China, or learn the report cards from children on an Indian reservation in Idaho. But I know statistically, without knowing you personally, you don't do that. Very few Americans do that. The majority of Americans use technology to create an even louder echo chamber of like-minded viewpoints, where they spend more and more time only hearing the voices of people who already share their preconceived ideas and their prejudices, creating a stronger sense of your viewpoints being right, and the less and less connection we have at a human level with people unlike ourselves, the more we vilify and ostracize and look to people who are different and address them as an other. And we know something, and I know this without being a doctor like you all, we know something physiologically about what happens over these 60 years. I don't give a flip who you all vote for, what you think ideologically, what your politics are. I'm asking you to take a step back and acknowledge that the current state of affairs and the trajectory we're on is deadening to empathy. It's poisonous to compassion. At a physiological level, it's becoming harder and harder for us as a people to be creative and innovative and solve problems that address family and children outside your own neighborhood, when fewer and fewer of us with this level of education, as represented in this room, have any personal connections to the majority of families for whom this is not the norm. Now, let's be clear about this. I know you all are from all over the country. This state, Georgia, successful, thriving New South state, city. Halfway through your sophomore year of college, you were better educated than 70% of this state. Better educated than 72% of my state, Alabama. The majority of children and families in our country, college is not part of their story. This feels normal to you all, the trajectory of college and work and success and moving up. There's nothing normal about this room. This is not average. The majority of Americans in our country are living paycheck to paycheck with little or no savings, working every hour they can find. And one of the biggest challenges we face in healthcare, in education, in any category that we care about that has to do with humanity is that we fill in the gaps. It's not as though the problem just ends up being people in power and people with relationships in power acknowledge, you know what, you're right. I grew up in the suburbs. I'm an elected leader, or I have a friendship with an elected leader. I would like to see our schools in poor neighborhoods get better, but I got to tell you, I don't know anything about it. That would be an easier starting point. The problem is the vast majority of college-educated Americans think they know exactly what's going on with poverty. They think they know exactly what the story is. You know how few issues there are in America that 9 out of 10 Americans agree on? 9 out of 10 Americans, when asked to close their eyes and picture poverty in our country, 9 out of 10 Americans answer that back the same way. Whose face are you looking at and where are they? Someone call out to me what 9 out of 10 of your countrymen say to that. A black face, where? In a city. Does that shock you that I told you that? How about this? Consider how educated you are. Literally the definition of the most educated, socially connected substrata of the wealthiest, most successful nation in the history of the world. That's what this room is. My guess is not all of you know that the defining quality of poverty for 9 out of 10 Americans, meaning a black person in the city, there are some poor black people in cities, no doubt. What percentage of poverty in our country is actually African American and urban? 10%. What percentage of poverty in our country overall, rural, urban, is black and poor? What percentage of poverty is black? 22%. To literally stand back and think about, and I don't give a, I was going to swear. I don't care what party is, to literally be living in an era as an educated, thoughtful, compassionate adult who wants our country to move forward and wants our health care to be more equitable, to literally think about what it means to have an elected leader. In this case, it happens to be a president, literally looking at a camera, campaigning for office, speaking to black people and saying, what do you have to lose? Your cities are terrible, your schools suck, your neighborhoods, literally not having any clue that 78% of black people aren't in poverty. And the corollary to that is just as important as the demographic ignorance. 9 out of 10 Americans also have a strong opinion about why they think poverty, which in their minds is all black, why it exists. 9 out of 10 Americans, the number one reason, laziness and a lack of effort. Let me just tell you something, factually. I'm not running for office, I don't care if you like me. Sociologically speaking, there are some poor people who happen to not be interested in working. There are similarly some very wealthy people, usually children of very wealthy people, who are the least productive citizens in our country, who are actively trying not to pay taxes. If you look at non-ideological research, they would put it at 3 to 4% at the lower end of the economic spectrum, able-bodied adults actively trying not to work or pay taxes. Similarly, 3 to 4% at the highest end, costing the Treasury far more than the lower end. But I'll tell you this, I don't give a flip about either 3%. I don't have any interest in defending either one. What I want to tell you is the vast majority of Americans are literally working every hour they can find. The majority of people who are facing food insecurity, now because the Hispanic population has grown, it's no longer a majority. Always the biggest percentage of poverty in our country has been white and rural, and it is today as it was at the beginning of the nation. There's great research that came out last year comparing the national response to the Clintons' failed attempt at universal health care to Obamacare. Do you know the seething, consistent difference in the language? There were a lot of people against it in the early 90s. It changed to be much more angry and vitriolic. There's one overarching reason. The vast majority of white Americans believe Obamacare and the expansion of Medicaid is to give a lot more shit to black people that don't deserve it. That's a fact. That's not my opinion. The vast majority of Americans don't realize that the largest percentage of Medicaid recipients are white. The vast majority of Americans don't realize that the largest percentage of recipients of food stamps are white, always have been. Literally 2 weeks ago, our knucklehead president, and that's not partisan at all. I love some Republicans. Our knucklehead Republican, on his way out the door on some other topic, turned back and said, I think what we're going to tackle next is welfare reform. We really got to bring work into this. And people were clapping. When he said that, I thought to myself, thank God. We need a reboot, because I know the vast majority of Americans have no idea what the story of welfare currently is. I want people to start writing it about it again, because I'll tell you this, the vast majority of Americans think they know the story. The majority of white people in our country still think either the biggest or the second biggest expenditure of our federal government is paying black people to sit at home or aren't working. How many of you, as educated as you are right now, how many families in America are on welfare? Switched from AFDC to TANF in the 90s. Welfare, cash payments, cash transfers. This is Georgia. There's 10.5 million people in the state. 1.5 of them are below the poverty line. How many families are on TANF in Georgia as of 6 months ago? 8,200. That's not even the end zone where my team plays football. Alabama is one of the poorest states in the country. 4.9 million people. The majority of children are on free reduced lunches. How many families in Alabama are on welfare? 7,100. Mississippi, poorest state in the country. How many families are draining the federal coffers for an average of $140 for a family? 6,000. There is no welfare. 1.1 million people nationwide. Less than 0.8 of 1% of black people in our country are on welfare. And yet the vast majority of Americans, Republican and Democrat, believe it's a majority black program and costing billions and billions a year. What we need more than thoughtful, progressive, compassionate people standing up when they hear racially tilted, antagonistic opinions coming to the defense of black people and feeling charitable. I rarely meet black people who need people to be charitable. What they need us to know are the damn facts. One thing to keep in mind that we all get wrong, just a result of human psychology, we all start to define the status quo as normal. The older we get, the more education we have, it's even harder for us to be open-minded. The majority of Americans, when asked to rate their own sense of humor on a scale of 1 to 10, think they're between a 7 and a 9. That's factually not true. Most of you are 5s. When you ask people if they're to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 in driving, most American men think they're above an 8. Most are 4 and 5s. I don't really care about those. They're funny, but the one I do care about is when you ask Americans to rate themselves compared to other Americans in open-mindedness. And I bet this applies to most of you. Oh, no. I know I'm not that funny, but I'm incredibly open-minded. Most Americans think they're above an 8 in open-mindedness. One of the challenges with moving culture is it's hard to get better at something when we all think we're great at it already. And you won't take this personally because I don't know you personally, so you shouldn't be offended. Most of you are not open-minded at all by any rational assessment of the term. Culture is one of those things Americans get terribly wrong. You hear people talking about a failed school. Parents are upset, communities, and someone will always say from the side, well, don't blame the damn teachers. That's a cultural issue in that neighborhood. Usually what they mean when they're saying that is, that's a black issue, meaning that's impenetrable, multi-generational behavioral issues. Most Americans, they think of culture as unchanging. Well, let me tell you something. Culture is powerful. A family's culture, expectations for grades, for your future, aspirations, a culture of a school, a culture of a city, a nation has a culture. But let's be clear, culture is completely malleable. It's completely transformable when the right language is used and the right pieces are put in place and the right leadership is in place. And we see this example after example. And in terms of college students who are aspiring to go to medical school, who would jump through any damn hoop you put in front of them, I'm not sure why the best 40 medical schools in the country don't send a polite letter back to every suburban senior applying from college and saying, this is a very impressive record. I appreciate your interest in our school. We would love to consider you. But at least take a year or two to go make a damn difference in someone else's life, and then you can come back to your own path of ambition. Because we know something about experiential learning for college students and recent college graduates. It can be transformative, much more so than me standing at a chalkboard trying to get students to learn the statistics about poverty. This season, which is not even over yet, we have 850 college students, very few of whom are accountants, who we've convinced to go through 8 hours of tax training, to take a 2-hour test, to work at tax sites to prepare taxes for low-income families, to avoid predatory tax preparers, on average, who charge now $400 a tax return. If you make $150,000 and live in the suburb and you go to a CPA, your average rate to a CPA last year was $200. If you work at Walmart in any state where it's represented by this room and you've got one W-2, the questions are confusing, the IRS is intimidating, you want someone to help you. Accountants aren't charging those people money. To an accountant, that would seem unethical. There's an entire industry that's grown to prey on people's desperation. And the vast majority of college Americans don't know anything about the industry, don't know anything about the families. And so we work incredibly hard to recruit students, led by recent graduates. About 30 of the 72 are headed to medical school, and we put them through training so they're tax experts, and they lead college students in Alabama, part of Tennessee, part of South Carolina. In about 10 weeks, a team of 22-year-olds leading close to 700 and something college students serve over 12,000 low-income families, helping them secure over $18 million of refunds, conservatively saving $5 million of out-of-pocket costs. But the real value is what happens at the table. Almost every college student writes these reflection exercises. 2 weeks into the season, they all write the same thing. Even the self-described liberals. I just had no idea how hard people work. There's such a thundercloud of bias in our country. If you're talking about a family making $20,000, $25,000 a year, that laziness is at the heart of that story. And I'll tell you, the vast majority of families in our nation making $20,000 a year, at the heart of the story is unbelievably hard work and aspiration and being cheated by business owners who are from college graduated classes who come into their community to take money from them. And it transforms students and graduates. Last thing I would say, can I have 30 seconds? I'm over. Wendy Kopp, quirky Princeton student in the early 90s, started to feel what I'm talking about, feeling the disconnect. She was passionate about education, but it's a similar story to what you all are passionate about. She wanted to engage her generation. She went and met with principals in the South Bronx. The principal says, one of the challenges I have, I'm not finding teachers who've had college biology, much less have succeeded at and get a teaching degree. And Wendy said, what if I could recruit a Princeton graduate who has a 3.8 in biology but hasn't had an education degree? Would that be helpful? And the principal's like, shit, yeah, send her to me. I'll handle the teaching. Send me someone. She pretty quickly reaches out to the Mississippi Delta, same conversation. You can have a thoughtful debate about the long-term legitimacy of Teach for America, but regardless of your position, the wisdom in how it happened is this. That quirky graduate student starts an initiative in her dorm room, and she calls it Teach for America. I want talented college graduates to commit 2 years to one of the most malfunctioning schools in America. Now 60% of those 2-year teachers stay in education afterward. But that first year, think about starting your own nonprofit in your dorm room if you'd have the guts to do this. She got this point. She starts recruiting just at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia. She's interviewing a kid with a 3.7 in English from Columbia. They have a good interview, and she goes like this. Sarah, I really appreciate your interest in this. You're obviously a very talented young woman. Unfortunately, you just didn't make the cut. Teaching children in our most challenging communities is only for the most talented, exceptional Americans we have, and you didn't quite make it. Sarah leaves the interview. She calls her mom. She's like, Mom, shit, I didn't even get the job to teach poor kids. And word starts to spread. Wow. That's a big deal to get one of those positions. And literally 3 years later, she's got 10,000 applicants just from the Ivy League. 8 years later, 20% of Yale's graduating class is applying to Teach for America. 18% of Harvard's graduating class. Literally out of whole cloth, redefining the culture of what it means to serve children who need talent the most. This is not charitable. This is not just something to do on your spare time. If you want a life of excellence, it means this is the work you're going to do. And not all of you are even going to be able to get the damn opportunity to do it. That applies with what hoops you can put college students who aspire to be doctors through. Don't underestimate this organization, this room, this movement's ability to completely redefine the culture of what it means to be someone who even gets to consider the privilege of going to medical school in our country. That's in your palms. Thank you all.
Don't fool yourself into thinking technology is connecting us. It can. But if used incorrectly, that's my insertion, it only serves to create like-minded echo chambers of similar viewpoints that make it easier for us to vilify the other. Mr. Stephen Black, I think that is going to be seared into my brain for a long time. One of the things and challenges in global health is that we love technology, and I truly believe that technology holds that power to make the world a smaller place and help us lean into building healthcare models. But the caution that you have shared with the room today, I think, is important, as those of us who call ourselves innovators lean into making the world a better place. So I thank you for that reminder. And now I would like to open it up for questions.